loads of people I know now are becoming positive. I'm sure you know lots as well now. I'm not yet. I've tested again today, and I'm still I'm still showing negative. So I did have sort of tiredness and a bit of a cold over the weekend. But where are we? But I'm still negative. There you go. So whether the 3 doses of the vaccine are protecting me, I suspect they probably are, because everyone's been exposed by now. We know that. We're all going to be exposed. So that was the first graph, common cold symptoms, COVID cold. It's not saying some people don't get severe disease. I don't want this to be misinterpreted. Some people do, but it's the vast minority. So COVID now the most common cause of colds in the UK. Huge growth in cases. Now, this is the full list of symptoms from the COVID symptom tracker app of what people get. So 73% of people who test positive get a runny nose, 68% get a headache, 64% get fatigue, 60% get sneezing, sore throat, persistent cough, hoarse voice, a range of other symptoms, chills, fever, dizziness, brain clouding, sort of brain fog. Some still get altered sense of smell, just 23%. Eye soreness, unusual muscle pains. Interesting, this one was much higher in South Africa, wasn't it? A lot more people in South Africa getting unusual muscle pains, less in the UK. Not feeling hungry, skipping meals, loss of smell, chest pain, swollen glands, feeling down psychologically, which is depression. So that's the full list in the UK, which I thought was pretty interesting. Now, first thing to do is I want to go and look at the Office for National Statistics from the UK, which is here. We look at this quite often. We've looked at this graph recently when we do our numbers updates, but the Office for National Statistics is definitely the best source for information in the UK. So talking about long COVID, so we're talking about sequelae in general, but starting off with long COVID. Long COVID continues to affect more than 1 million people. In fact, 1.3 million people in the UK suffering from long COVID at the moment. That's 2% of the entire population. And that is in the 4 weeks to December the 6th, up to when this data is available. So that is a lot of people. And I think in the States, I'd be surprised if it wasn't 2% of the whole population as well. I would expect this data to be reasonably transferable wherever you are. Long COVID for less than 12 weeks was 21% of the 1.3 million. Long COVID for more than 12 weeks was 70% of the 1.3 million, and 40%, well over 500,000, had had long COVID features for more than a year. And if these features are persisting for more than a year, that does become concerning, because you get more worried about the possibility of there being some actual damage to the tissues of the body, more worried about features for more than, and 40%, well over 500,000, had had long COVID features for more than a year. And if these features are persisting for more than a year, that does become concerning, because you get more worried about the possibility of there being some actual damage to the tissues of the body. Still a lot to learn about this disease, of course. 20% of the 1.3 million reported their ability to undertake day-to-day activities have been limited a lot. Symptoms: fatigue, loss of smell, shortness of breath, difficulty in concentrating are the main things that people are reporting with long COVID. Self-reporting of long COVID was greatest in 35 to 69-year-old age, so less in under 35s, less in over 69s, interesting. More common in females. People living in more deprived areas reported more long COVID. Those working in health and care and social care reported more long COVID. Those with another activity limiting health condition, in other words, those with comorbidities, that one's to be expected. And surprisingly, those in teaching or education as well. So the only thing that comes to mind there is those in teaching or education, or those in healthcare, are probably exposed to a lot more people. So in healthcare, on hospital ward, you can be exposed to 100 people a day quite easily, coming and going, and patients, and again, students, pupils in schools, hundreds of them. So teachers could well be more exposed to a different variety of viruses than the rest of us. Now, before we go on to diabetes, I want to look at something really interesting, and this is worth sticking with. It's called Encephalitis Lethargicus. So let's look at Encephalitis Lethargicus. Encephalitis means inflammation of the brain, itis, encaph, inside the skull, It means inflammation of the brain. Lethargica means the patients are lethargic, inactive. Now, this is what came after the 1918-19 pandemic. So what we have here is this is the death rate up here from Encephalitis Lethargica. That's the death rate, and that's the death. They're the deaths in Scotland. So they're in England. They're in England. They're the figures for Scotland. In other words, it's common figures. The solid line is England and Wales, and as we see, the other countries had similar amounts. So there we are, 1918, 1919. This was the time of the acute pandemic, when people actually had the virus. So the virus began about 1918 and finished, well, it started to go down quite dramatically in 1919. There were still small amounts of it around actually for quite some time, but it wasn't causing much illness right up until about right up towards the end of this graph, actually up until the 1950s. There was very small amounts, but basically we could say 1918, 1919. So if we say the pandemic more or less finished about then we see death rates continued to go up. Then they went down, then death rates shot up, and they started going up, what, 1923, 1924. So this is 3-4 years after the end of the pandemic that this became a big problem. So there was this delayed effect. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen with COVID-19, not at all. But we do have a lot to learn from history, and we'll see why we have that in a minute. So, and then deaths continued right up until the end of this data sequence in 1940. 1939 anyway. So that was one of the sequelae, we assume, of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. Now that was influenza, it wasn't coronavirus. I'm not saying these are comparable, but it does show that complications can go on for a long time after a mass of people. And of course, right now, everyone is being affected with COVID-19. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, not by any means. I don't think it will. But it's interesting, and it's something we have to be aware of, because the purpose of this channel is not to raise alarm, but there again, it's not to hide our heads in the sand either. It's to be as realistic as possible, and this is the way my thinking's been going lately, and this is a concern. So what's going to happen after that? Now, just a little bit more about this Encephalitis Lethargica. Now, I've never seen a case. There are similar disease. There is a similar neurological disease today, but very rare. But when I was training, the old people at the time had treated many patients with this condition. It used to be quite well known. And another one that went after it, called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, where the people get tremors and rigidity. So sometimes called sleepy sickness, not sleeping sickness. That's trypanosomiasis. That's the tropical parasite. This is called sleepy sickness. So brain disease is an encephalitis. Status-like condition, speechless and motionless. So status means that they're just here but not here really, speechless, motionless. 1 million victims or more, 500,000 deaths. This was a huge sequelae of the 1918-1919 pandemic, but not a lot of people know about these days. In fact, I've even done a quiz on some doctor friends recently, asking them to tell me about Encephalitis Lethargica, and let's just say most of them struggled. Most survivors never returned to full vigour. Oliver Sacks, famous British-trained American working neurologist, he did a special study on this. Oliver Sacks probably qualified about like late 50s, early 60s, so there were still a few around. He did a study on it, and then he did some historical work as well. He said they would be conscious and aware, yet not fully awake. They would sit motionless and speechless all day in their chairs, totally lacking energy, impetus, initiative, motive, appetite, affect, or desire. No mood at all. No desire at all. They registered what went on about them without active attention and with profound indifference. They neither conveyed nor felt the feeling of life. They were as insubstantial as ghosts and as passive as zombies. A pretty frightening description from Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist. And then what he did was, this is really quite fascinating, he looked back to see if there was any historical precedent for this condition, because before about 1915, 1916, there were no cases of this. It just occurred, and then the pandemic seemed to greatly exacerbate it. And of course, we've got a pandemic of diabetes now, which could be exacerbated, which is kind of the point I'm getting to, really. So it seemed to be similar to a disease called the English sweats, which occurred in 1529. Was this after a outbreak of a virus several years later? I don't think we know that. Could have been. Similar condition in Italy in 1597, similar condition in Germany in 1672, similar condition in Sweden in 1754 to 57. So he looked back in history and found similar conditions, and as we said, post-encephalitic Parkinsonism used to be very common as well. So that's just a historical sort of reminder, really. An existing condition that just seemed to be massively exacerbated by the pandemic. So what I am concerned about, as I've said, is diabetes, because, well, I'm concerned about diabetes anyway, because at the moment about 9% of the world's population is diabetic. We have a pandemic of diabetes. Diabetes means your blood sugar levels rise, you can't control the glucose in your body, that causes all sorts of complications like strokes, heart attacks, blindness, kidney failure, feet going black, needing amputations, lots of horrible complications from diabetes, as well as the acute complication of death in type 1 diabetes. That can also occur if it's not managed.
телевизор.
So risk of post-COVID diabetes. Now this is from the Centers for Disease Control. This is the paper here in the States. Now it amazes me that the Centre for Disease Control can take such good data and make it so hard to understand. The writing is really, I think it's terrible. It's so difficult to decode what the heck they're talking about. But anyway, I think I have. So let's just look at it briefly, and basically there is an increased risk, of course. Now, European paediatric, American spelling, paediatric populations during the COVID-19 pandemic had showed increased risk of COVID-19 leading to more diabetes. Now, we know that increased risk of severe COVID in people with diabetes already, but European data is showing in all age groups, as far as we know. We don't have specific figures on it, but people who have COVID are more likely to type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 is the insulin-dependent type, where it's an autoimmune disease that destroys the insulin-secreting cells in the pancreatic cell, the pancreatic islets of Langerhans, the beta cells in the pancreatic islets. Type 2 is more an inability to use insulin, usually, although type 2 is a bit of a complicated disease. If you want to know about diabetes, I have done a full video series of 23 lectures on diabetes, and I'll put the link to the first one if you are interested in following diabetes up seriously. Increasing the number of type 1 diabetes diagnoses, unfortunately. Increased frequency of severity of diabetic ketoacidosis. Now, if someone develops type 1 diabetes and they're not diagnosed, they'll develop what we call diabetic ketoacidosis. So this means the blood becomes acidic and there are ketones. The ketones accumulate in the body, just the same way as they do to a lesser extent with a ketogenic diet, which you've probably heard of. So Centre for Disease Control, they took groups, diabetes incidence among patients aged less than 18 after a COVID diagnosis, makes sense. Diabetes incidence amongst those matched by age and sex who had no COVID diagnosis. So good that they had one group there and one group there to compare the two groups. So diabetes in people who hadn't had COVID, diabetes in people who had COVID. And obviously both of these groups developed diabetes, which you would expect. But they also did a third group receiving a group who received a pre-pandemic non-COVID-19 acute respiratory infection diagnosis. So basically they were looking at people who had COVID, people who hadn't had COVID, people that got diabetes who hadn't had COVID.
Пора бы уж за уходящий.
Когда вы все соберемся, вот тогда и будет цепочка.
Все уже давно приехали. Ждем только тебя. Ты успеваешь?
Да, конечно. Ну давай-ка быстрее. Не...
specialty is the 20th century, but I've come here to Jerusalem because I want to find out what life was like in the first century. Look at this. A job that's still here after 2,000 years. Money changer. In this famous scene from the Gospels, Jesus sees the money changers in the temple. He overturns their tables and drives them out of the temple. Everybody's always been interested in the commotion Jesus caused. But I want to know what all these people were doing at the temple that day, and what they all did for a living. What were their jobs like? And what drove the economy? The hillsides around the city of Nazareth contain ruins that date back to biblical times. They've helped archaeologists and biblical scholars recreate what Nazareth would have looked like in Jesus' time. James Tabor, a biblical scholar specializing in the life of Jesus, is here to show me just how real it is. But listen, James, was Nazareth really like this?
I don't even think it could be reproduced, no matter what you did. Think about the crowdedness, the smells, the cacophony of sounds.
The
animals walking around, the dung in the street.
I was thinking it must have stunk.
It would have to. We're going to go into one of the houses here. Notice as we step inside through the door, we're actually outside in this courtyard area, this workshop area. 90% of the life is outdoors, even though you're in the house with a bit of shelter from the sun. Think of all of these activities that go on in a village, particularly the manufacturing, like somebody's going to be making the pottery, somebody's going to be baking the bread.
Everybody does that out of their house.
Out of their house. So it really gives you a sense of that workshop atmosphere. And here's an example of the weaving.
After shearing the sheep and washing the wool, the weaver does what's called carding the wool, opening it up and separating the fibers so they can work them on the loom.
That's been cleaned and worked on. How long does it take you to clean the wool? Like
3 months.
3 or 4 months. And
Can I try that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm holding it like
Yes.
that, and
You roll it.
spin.
Yes, and move your fingers with it. You need to control your fingers with the spindle. Yes, that's it.
Yeah, it's easy for you
Move,
to
move,
say.
move, move. Move your fingers. That's it.
Do you
back and forth.
Yes.
like that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just let you do that. So everything's done here. Do you
Yes.
dye the wool here as
Yeah,
well?
we're dyeing the wool, we're carding the wool, we're spinning here, and after that we take to the loom to make fabrics. But it's take a long, long, long process.
But there's another job they're doing in this house that I want to see, because it's one of the most famous jobs in the Bible: carpentry. We've all been told that when Jesus wasn't overturning tables, he was making them. Now, some carpenter's tools haven't changed in 2,000 years, but some have. What's this tool for? Drill. A drill. It's nothing like my drill. Well, how do you use it? Can I try? It's really tricky. Now I know why they invented power tools. Yeah. This is hard. Is it common to have a small child in the workplace?
Absolutely. Judaism taught that if you don't train your son in a profession, you've abandoned him, basically.
We're in a carpentry shop. Most famous job in the world. I mean, is this how Jesus would have grown up?
Yeah, I think that's the image people have. It's certainly in the movies and the books. We've been studying the terms that are used, and Jesus is called a carpenter in English, but of course it wasn't written in English, written in Greek.
Right.
But the word actually is tekton, which means sort of artisan or a builder, like a stonemason, which really doesn't fit woodworking as much.
Right.
So it could be any kind of builder. You notice there's not a lot of wood in a home,
Right.
but more stone.
Lots of stuff.
And most of the examples when Jesus taught, he talks about stone so often.
So it's Jesus the stonemason, not Jesus the
That
carpenter.
really does seem to be the best interpretation of,
Really?
of the original text.
I mean, that's totally different than everything else we've ever been told before.
Yeah, I think the carpenter idea is romantic in a certain way. A better image is getting up at 3 in the morning and heading off to Cephras nearby for hard labor. at 4 or 5 in the morning, coming back near dark.
Stone was the most important building material in biblical times, and easy to get from the rocky terrain. So Jesus the stonemason may have worked right here. 2,000 years later, builders in Israel and around the world have hand-operated gantry cranes and water-cooled sawing machines. The modern builders here still use the local limestone. Building techniques might have changed,